pleased to say the Shadow Transport Secretary, Louise Haigh, is here this morning, and she got the memo, which is it's great to see you. Thank you. Plans for Britain's railways?
Yeah, so we know the current model is broken. Anyone who's had to rely on the railways recently knows that very well. We've got record delays, record cancellations and routine overcrowding. And that's because the system just isn't set up in a way that works for the passenger. So for too long, we've had this really fragmented model that means dozens of operators and interests work against each other rather than work in the interest of the passenger. I'll give you an example. When delays happen, armies of lawyers argue with each other about whose fault it is and who has to pay for the mistake rather than work out how to fix it. And that's why we want to sweep away that model and bring in a unified, simplified, publicly owned railways that can, from top to bottom, work in the interest of the passenger. So over time, we'll bring in every private operator as their contracts expire, so we won't have to pay a penny in compensation from the taxpayer, and we'll set up Great British Railways, which will be an independent, publicly owned body that will be responsible for track and train, and as I say, can be single-mindedly focused on delivering for passengers.
So renationalising the railways, what other Corbyn-era policies are you looking at?
Well, this is a different model than the Jeremy Corbyn policy on rail nationalisation. But as you know,
the same thing.
Yeah, but with different outcomes and with a different policies beneath it, which I think is really important. As you know, we've committed to Great British Energy, which will be a publicly owned challenger to the other energy sectors, other energy companies. And I think where we've shown where the settlement just really isn't working, we are prepared to take the bold reform that is necessary, but we know that public finances are incredibly tight, and because railways can be done in a way that doesn't cost the taxpayer and actually we think can deliver significant savings for the taxpayer, then it's the right thing to do. But for example, in water, where it would cost the taxpayer potentially billions of pounds to nationalise those businesses, instead we set out really, really tough regulation and legislative reforms that would hold those water companies to account, because that's the right thing to do for customers and the taxpayer, and it's the pragmatic way forward.
But there was a reason that these companies were privatised in the first place. It wasn't called British Fail for nothing.
Well, there was a reason, and it was primarily ideology that the railways privatised in the first place. And, you know, you might remember Grant Shapps when he was Transport Secretary.
I do.
He responded to the Williams Review, which Chris Grayling commissioned into the railways. And in Grant Shapps' response, he said the reason that privatisation had never been accepted on British railways was because their failings had always been so obvious, that their fragmentation was more expensive, more confusing, and it made it difficult for trains to run on time. That's why the Williams Review was commissioned. That's why the Tories promised reform. And this morning, Keith Williams, the man who Chris Grayling commissioned to run that review and the architect of the Tories reforms, has actually endorsed Labour's plans.
But aren't some train companies already effectively nationalised, and yet still they're not very good?
No, exactly, and that shows the failings in the system, doesn't it?
It shows that even if you nationalise them, they're just not very good.
No, exactly. So that's why we've said, you know, just bringing those operators into public ownership alone wouldn't change the things that we need to do. That's why we're setting out a very detailed plan today, probably one of the more detailed plans that we've set out so far, to show exactly what we would do, the structural reforms we could take, because there are failings right across the system, and we need to bring track and train together and then have that entire culture of the organisation focused on the passenger. So as part of the reforms, for example, we're abolishing Network Rail, and the functions that they currently run will be delivered by Great British Rail. That's really important because Network Rail has not been delivering its performance.
I mean, TfL is a government body. It's pants, some might say.
Well, TfL runs in a slightly different way, but I would contend that that it's not doing a good job. We've got world-class public transport.
It's struggling to make ends meet, and they say they're on a cliff edge.
Well, I mean, obviously, everyone is struggling.
As far as funding is concerned.
Everyone is struggling post-COVID, and London is the only capital city in the world that doesn't get any kind of funding settlement from their central government. George Osborne scrapped the grant that was given to Transport for London when he was Chancellor, and they're only just coming off the COVID emergency settlement funding that they received. So they are coming back to pre-pandemic levels, but it has been a really big struggle.
How are you going to pay for it?
So the government had already set aside funding to set up their own body, Great British Railways. So we will take that and we'll use that to set up our own organisation. Yes, it will be to set up the body itself. But we actually believe, and the Tories have suggested themselves and other industry experts have gone further, that these reforms will save the taxpayer potentially billions of pounds per year by the end of 5 years, reducing the massive waste and inefficiencies that currently exist across the system. And frankly, the taxpayer can't afford to continue with the system as it is, and neither can passengers.
But bringing it back into public ownership won't necessarily mean that the trains will run on time, especially if there are strikes.
Well, absolutely, and we're into the second year of the first national strike in over 30 years, and that strike has been deliberately provoked by Conservative
But unions
ministers.
still strike under a Labour government.
They do, but not at the level that we've seen. We have faced...
I go back to 1979 and I rest my case.
But the government have deliberately provoked these strikes and they are not sitting down at the table. The Transport Secretary, my counterpart, has not sat down with the unions for 18 months now. They are willing these strikes on.
That's because it's privately owned. He's not supposed to.
The Department for Transport sets the mandate for the operators, and as you said, 4 of those operators are actually in public ownership. He has the power to sit down and negotiate, but he's deliberately prolonging this dispute because he thinks it sorts its political ends. He can blame the unions and the strikes for the fact that the trains aren't running on time, when in fact it's his failures and the failures of the system, as well as the unnecessary industrial disputes. And of course it would be one of my first priorities to resolve that.
So it will be in the manifesto, but given that it could take 6 years to put into place to bring all of those back into public ownership, you won't be able to do it in the first term.
So all of the current private operators' core terms expire within the first term. So I think the latest one is 2027. So we would absolutely achieve this within the first term of a Labour government.
It's good to see you. Thanks very much indeed for explaining that to us. Thank you.